All right, well, we have some people in the audience, so if we're ready, if you're all ready for it, then I will start introductions. All
Sounds good.
So in that case, welcome everyone. I am so glad that you're here to support authors and local readers and of course Grassroots Books. I'm Ashley, the event and social media coordinator for Grassroots, and tonight we have local author Tiffany Cates for her book M Theory, and she's participating in a virtual panel with local authors Beth Alvarado, Irene Cooper, and Bridget Lewis. Let me jump into a couple of introductions for these authors. Tiffany Cates spent 5 years navigating Chicago's transit and weather systems before moving to Oregon and earning her MFA in creative writing from Oregon State University. Influenced by her degrees in philosophy and psychology, Cates writes around themes of personhood, matters of free will, and the distance between self and other. Jillian in the Borderlands, a cycle of rather dark tales, is Beth Alvarado's fourth book. She has written extensively about her experience as a Euro-American woman marrying into a Mexican-American family and spent most of her life in Arizona. Her essay collection, Anxious Attachments, won a 2020 Oregon Book Award. Irene Cooper is the author of Committal, poet-friendly spy-fi about family from Vegetarian Alcoholic Press and Spare Change from Finishing Line Press. Writings appear in The Feminist Wire, Phoebe, Utterance, The Denver Quarterly, The Manifestation, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Irene co-edits The Stay Project and teaches in community in Oregon. Bridget Lewis is a writer born in Gold Country and destined for speculation. Her chapbook Origin Stories reimagines biblical tales from a modern perspective. Her writing has appeared in the Southampton Review, Diagram, Foglifter, the Bellingham Review, and elsewhere. So here's the way that tonight's event will work. Tiffany, Beth, Irene, and Bridget will lead their readings and a discussion for the majority of tonight's event, and then we'll open up the floor to a Q&A from audience members for the last 15 or so minutes. Please use the Q&A chat boxes to indicate if you have a question at any point during the presentation. Afterwards, we'll be using that to run the Q&A portion of the event. I also want to note that the link to buy M Theory and these other books will be in the chat shortly. I highly encourage you to buy them from us. Not only will you be supporting these women as authors, but also Grassroots as a small indie bookstore that's able to bring events like this to you. So all that being said, let me hand it off.
All right. I want to say thank you, and thank you to lovely ladies for doing this again with me. Tonight we're going to be talking about surprises in writing, and I'm just going to jump right in with surprises that occurred during M Theory, the writing of M Theory. So my first surprise was Donovan in general, not his character necessarily, but the work with M Theory, the group was split 50-50 on whether or not Donovan was a total creep or whether he was just a lonely guy, you know, who was just needing some friends and attention. This was really surprising to me that neither one would budge. And so I thought, moving forward with the novel, that was something that I really wanted to lean into a little more. So to start, I'm going to read the small segment from, and it hasn't changed very much from my first workshop. So I'm just going to be reading you the section that people really loved or hated him for. So, Mr. James. Lily, coming toward the end of a 4-year relationship with him that involved waiting and transgression and conversations about literature, stood shivering in the wind, ice crystals forming on her lashes. Welcome back. The cold had him digging deep into his pockets, searching for the warmers, kept there because gloves were inconvenient for flipping pages. You shouldn't wait for me on days like this, Lils. It's too cold. Lily disregarded him and reached into her bag for a delicately wrapped package of green and red matte paper. Merry Christmas. She required more than a teacher. She required common sense and the ability to see things for what they really were. The snow whirled and sprinkled the gift surface with tiny 6-pointed flakes of perfection. Donovan's slightly warmed hands entered the cold with an outward autonomy that only understood his internal hesitation once the package was in hand. We already exchanged gifts. A handmade throw in the colors of Man U, a copy of Voltaire's Alphabet of Wit. Just open it. Her smile nudged his hands into motion, and she waited for the box to be opened before saying anything else. I figured you'd need a new one. The scarf's material was soft against her fingertips, black and gray plaid with a dark red stripe. Not the dark green of the one he'd lost, but much more sumptuous and inviting. Tucking the box under his arm, he began to wrap the warm material around Lily, who clearly needed it more than he did. But she stepped away and shook her head. I bought it for you. I know, and I thank you, but your eyelashes are frozen, so let me do this. Holding her chin up, she stood still and allowed him to wrap the scarf around her neck. Suddenly, made uncomfortable by the intimacy of the act he'd initiated. Did you miss me? She asked. His hands found their way back into the safety of his pockets. I'm glad to be back. Lily's face showed the disappointment of the unanswered question. She led the way toward the school, leaving him to navigate the slippery slope of keeping her where she was in his life without further complicating their relationship. What did you think of Dr. Faustus? I think, instead of covering transgressions in literature every year, you should cover social ineptitude. The pressure behind her words told him that they were intended to sting, and they walked the remaining blocks in silence. The mess of children before them slushed down the salted sidewalks, leaving footprints that rapidly lost their imprint to the falling snow, reminding Donovan of unwanted words erased from a page. When they reached the school, he, Mr. James, held the door open for his student and watched her silently unwrap the scarf, the warmth of the indoors already melting its collected snow. I'll see you during my free period then, he asked. Her smile said something he couldn't yet determine, while her mouth said, this is how I know you miss me. Not needing to say anything in return, he took the scarf and watched Lily as she fell into a blur against the other students drifting down the hall, a disappearance that knocked on a door and returned his thoughts to the pale skin, flaming hair smile of the lady in the blue coat, his previously unobserved observer. So that was the first part there. The second really large surprise in M Theory is the character Leslie, who is Detective Powell. He was never meant to be in the novel, so that in itself was a surprise. He was supposed to be a character in another novel, but by the time I had completed, by the time I went to the first workshop, actually, Leslie had snuck in to M Theory, and he appeared small at the end of every one of Donovan's chapters, and slowly over the course of drafts became a major character within the book. 7 months later, Donovan knew the truth of his relationships and what they had become. His attempts to get what he needed had failed, and now he had to meet the man who could save anything he had left. There were calls made in advance, awaiting for wellness, routes that needed to be plotted so he could run there and back, preserving his speech and steadying his thoughts. But the doctor noticed him when he entered the hospital room. A quick glance followed by the double stuttering of eyes trying to pinpoint the exact location of Donovan's familiarity, until his presence felt like a surprise to them both. A tanned hand, still capable of movement, gestured toward a chair, and Donovan did as instructed, always doing as instructed. He watched the incapacitated body of the detective for the movement it had been capable of when a 15-minute conversation set into motion the events leading them all to this room, this moment, this uncomfortable chair made of an easily hosed down material that lacked the support necessary for a long visit. This keen awareness of his spine and how it moved and bent and made running possible. This conversation that would not negate what had happened, but could preserve and make real a memory. Donovan's eyes caught on a book he'd read and given and discussed and never gotten back. Its presence in the dim lit room made him uncomfortable, told him there was more happening than what he'd been told or knew, but that he could contain it if he stuck to the plan. Despite this knowing, he pointed to the balm on the book's cover and asked, "Where did you get that?" "Give me a minute," the detective said. "We're almost done here." The minutes stretched with a slow tick, tick, tick of a clock whose second hand had been stuck between 8 and 10 for days, weeks even. A single moment lived in repeat and without escape until the doctor exited the room and Donovan wished to leave with him, believed he could, knew his legs were capable. This proximity to truth made him uncomfortable. "What can I do for you, Mr. James?" He looked at the detective and couldn't feel sympathy for him, even while knowing he was supposed to. So I'm going to end there. And next up, I think we're doing Beth.
Yes, those were such good passages, Tiffany. Okay, I'm going to read from Jillian in the Borderlands, but first I want to thank Grassroots, and I want to thank Tiffany for having us share this night with her, and Irene and Bridget for reading too. So I'm going to read a little section that's from later in the book, one of the last stories, and it's where Jillian meets Carlos, who's going to be her love interest. It takes place in Magdalena, Mexico, where Carlos and his mother have made a pilgrimage to see Juana of God, who is a traditional healer. And so you just need to know that Jillian doesn't speak. She draws to communicate. And in this story, she's been painting murals on the Casa de los Olvidados, which is the house of the forgotten ones, where Juana heals people. That's where Juana does her healing. Jillian and Juana had been sitting outside of Jorge's cafe, drinking Bloody Marys and eating tacos de lengua when Gloria and Carlos first approached them. Evidently, Gloria had noticed Jillian sketching the pilgrims and hoped she would do their portrait. Siéntense, siéntense, Juana had welcomed them, moving her chair closer to Jillian so there would be room for them at the table. Join us, pero entienden que this isn't Montmartre. She draws only for herself. Jillian held up her hand as if to say, "Okay, it's okay." And then she studied their faces. She drew quickly, but only the mother, her smooth hair, a smooth face, her eyes expectant, because this is what Jillian knew the mother would want. Her 30 years younger self, herself as she wished to be, all possibilities still in front of her. None of this knowledge that life can change in a way you never wanted. None of this sorrow. Jillian ripped the drawing out of the sketch pad and handed it to her. "Oh, but I wanted one of us together," the mother said. "Pues sí," Juana said. "That would have been ideal." Jillian had already sketched Carlos when she first noticed him in the crowd of pilgrims. She had sketched him in his greenish underwater world, although it wasn't underwater exactly. It was moonlit and starlit with shadows moving through the soupy green, skinny beams of light shooting back and forth, bubbles of light trailing in an arc through the sky, and then big lasers from shadows in the sky. Explosions of light led to explosions of darkness, then a shower of fireflies. Why green, she wondered. She looked at Carlos. His food had come and he was hunched over it. No one is going to take it away from you, she thought. And then she heard the words, electrons, clouds of electrons. They excite the phosphors, which are painted on a screen. When she looked down at her drawing, she heard other words. Go, 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 Roger that. Swearing, of course, and then there were other sounds, the rapid zinging of automatic weapons, the percussion of explosions, but they were a kind of background noise for the voices, because she supposed she was hearing his thoughts, his memories, and in them the sounds of the weapons receded, but the voices stayed. Some were simply human voices in languages she couldn't understand. Some were animal sounds made by human animals, the language of fear or pain or dying that needs no translation. But it was hard to hear anything more than that. What with the noise of the fiesta all around them, and with Juana explaining to Gloria about the casa, the demented elderly, and the head injured young. Those are our, como se dice, los norteamericanos, where everything is bottom lines. Pero what is my bottom line? I asked myself el otro día. Who would benefit most from la casa de los olvidados? Y ya lo sabía. Those who can never be healed, but who want to live with freedom, tú sabes, as if their minds were still whole. Jillian closed her eyes and decided to put her hand on Carlos. After all, what could happen? He was already a shadow of himself. He could shrug himself further away if that was even possible. He could stand and leave, but he didn't. She could feel that her own fingers were cool when they touched his arm, and they warmed up as his memories started seeping out. Whispers of Carlos, the memories in his muscles, the things he had buried inside. No egress, she heard, and then enfilade. She saw doorways in a line, enfilade, as in to thread a needle from the French. She waited. No, as in a volley of gunfire, a valley of gunfire, along a line, from end to end, gunfire from end to end, enfilade, 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 no egress. He'd been trapped. He was still trapped. He had lost people. They had not wanted to leave this earth, but at the moment they did, all their love and all their grief had him. She felt their electricity passing from him to her, and eventually she knew she would release it into the paintings on the walls of the Casa de los Olvidados, where finally it could be breathed out into the air. That's the end. Thank you. Bridget.
Beth, that was beautiful. All right, well, I want to continue the thanks that have been going out so naturally. And I want to thank the folks who have chosen to join us here tonight. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I have a chapbook out that, as you may have heard in my bio, reimagines biblical tales. It's called Origin Stories. And I'm not going to read a piece from the chapbook. I'm working on extending that collection. So I'm going to read to you a piece that will be a part of that future collection. And I'm going to read a piece in its entirety, so I'm not going to give you any introduction other than that. I swore to myself I wouldn't chop my hair off when I got old, Eve says, but maybe. She is standing in front of an antique mirror. She is turning her head from one side to the other. Shadowy black specks in the glass add the illusion of dimension, a topo map, as if the surface is buckling into valleys. Her reflection is buckling into valleys. Stop that, Lilith says over Eve's shoulder as she moves past her down the hallway, drink in hand. Eve straightens and turns to Lilith, a sliver of smile on her face. They have made a pact never to talk about the heat. It is the only topic that's off limits. Maybe 500 million years ago, Lilith wouldn't have known where Eve was going with this cutting of the hair comment, but now she does. Getting one's hair off the shoulders was an obvious gateway to how good it could feel, no? Against this oppressive, world-ending heat. Do it or don't do it, Lilith says over her shoulder, but we aren't going to talk about the weather. Mary Magdalene has come from the kitchen with 2 more copper mugs. Shall we? She says to Eve. The 3 of them are sitting in weathered Adirondack chairs on the back patio like they do every evening, toasting the end of the world with an old-timey cocktail, the recipe for which Mary digs up in an old bartending guide or cookbook. To getting old, Lilith says, raising her glass. To being old, says Eve. To the end, says Mary Magdalene. They bring their mugs together, metal on metal on metal. They had been born in a warm part of time-place, But that was nothing compared to now. The sun had always been getting hotter, hotter and hotter and hotter. The oceans were now beginning to evaporate. Of course, this added vapor in the atmosphere only made it warmer. It too is a greenhouse gas. And now a biofeedback cycle that would end the epoch of habitable Earth. No more life on Earth. Their copper mugs sweat as the ice melts rapid fire. The heat, the humidity, the rate at which they need to drink a cocktail if they want to feel something cool on their throats. They can't help but get a little tipsy. Do you remember when the Earthlings tried to go to Mars? Lilith says. Her voice is tender. She has seen a lot in her lifetime. Eve and Mary look at one another. Of course, says Eve. Some did more than try, says Mary Magdalene. They don't talk much about the rest of the humans now that they had buried their dead with great respect and they let them rest in peace. This is what they would do now, here, again, until it became so hot not even they could survive. Mary Magdalene's story had always been about bearing witness, to not avert one's eyes. This is not a gift, she said to Lilith and Eve, when they told her they would stay with her until the end. But it's necessary, Eve said, and important, said Lilith. Teach us how not to avert our eyes, said Eve. A stone box in tunnel territory is best packed by a group, Lilith said. Eve and Mary raised a respective brow and started to laugh. Sometimes sayings from the most ancient of languages don't translate well. You don't need to do this alone, Mary said. Eve's arms are wrapped around her bent legs, her chin resting on her knees. The dress she is wearing has risen up her shins, and she can see that, as usual, there is paint on her feet, this time red and pink and yellow. Circles, drops of varying sizes, small to medium to minuscule. Where tears have dropped, rain has fallen, art has been made. To her right, Lilith is looking intently forward. 50 feet from the edge of the patio is a drop-off that leads to what once was a river far below. Beyond that, an escarpment of umber rocks. Beyond that, the setting sun. Eve turns to her left. Mary is watching the sunset too. Her eyes are big and light-colored and clear and let everything in. Eve turns to join them. She is remembering the times when she saw the green flashes. She is remembering other deeply saturated goodbyes. And now this one, unique in its own right, setting in her and her swooning in response, billions and billions of sunsets, and none of them can look away. Thank you. And last but not least, Irene Cooper will read for us.
These are so good. And thank you, yes, thank you, Tiffany and Beth and Bridget. Thank you, Grassroots. I'm gonna read a story. Would everybody hold up their books so we can see these covers, please? Art. Thank you. Those all have good stories too. So committal was introduced as speculative spy-fi because it's a lot of things, and speculative and spy-fi are two of them. I think what surprised me about this book and what I still have arguments about in my domestic sphere is who is the protagonist. My partner will always say the young man in the book is the protagonist, and I will always disagree because the more I started to write about Esther, the more she emerged. Excuse me. Esther's deletions. Just how many were there over the years, thought Esther as she sat. Too many to keep track. There was a time she could have listed her deletions accurately by mission, number, method, in meticulous detail, but domesticity had overridden her operative mind. So much to think about in the course of a day. Bellies to fill, laundry, 1,000 tasks always, plus neighbors, people, so many people, even in this small town. Some days she was lucky if she could remember her own name, her original name. though she supposed Esther was a good deal more real in countless ways than her former self. At first, she was alarmed by the starched woman who showed up and sent Penelope packing, but it appeared that Mrs. Stewart was a legitimate nurse after all. Lamb wanted her alive then, at least for now. Well, never was really bloodthirsty. Esther thought they might have been friends. Still, the stakes were high, and he was in no position to make sentimental allowances or allowances of any kind. Obviously, he didn't want her involved. He wanted Toker. It seemed to Esther that Lamb was banking entirely too heavily on blood ties. I'm attended to, she thought, but still incapacitated. Evidently, she had time to reflect. For some long while after Toker became her only mission, Esther operated on the same vibration as when she was active in the field, perpetually on alert. The first one was a reflex. A lesser operator might have second-guessed her actions, doubted the legitimacy of the target, but in those days, Esther never doubted herself, and she was never wrong. The object of the deletion was grotesquely obvious to one who survived on perception and knew to instinctively and immediately acclimate to her environment. He'd been too well dressed and wasn't even selling anything. When he approached her in the feed parking lot, offering to help her load her manure into the truck, with baby Toker cooing in the car seat, and took the interloper out as soon as she could reach him. In two swift motions, he was broken and loaded into the flatbed amid the bags of excrement. Esther disposed of the body before the baby woke up from his nap. Some of them ran together in her memory. She confused the one she deleted via grilled cheese sandwich. She'd added a sprinkle of accelerator, which acted on the milk fat in the American cheese food, causing the LDL cholesterol in the blood to expand, immediately filling the blood vessels like foam insulation. With the deletion that ate a plate full of cheese curds and gravy, and quite organically went into cardiac arrest, for which, of course, she failed to provide CPR. It was inexplicable why these morons ate her cooking. She assumed it was the convincing visual. Her house dress and apron inspired a false but potent sense of comfort and safety. They always, always underestimated her and overestimated her cooking. However, these inept operatives thought they were going to die, they didn't think it would be by a warm batch of cookies, but sometimes it was. She knew they would come, but she was determined not to live on the run. The minute after, give young Toker a stable environment to make for him an ordinary home. She knew these confrontations in parking lots would grow more complicated as the boy grew. She knew she needed help. Another operative was out of the question. She'd already gone rogue with the decision to raise the baby herself. She'd not only taken herself out of the hiring pool, she'd taken on a mission guaranteed to alienate her colleagues. No one on the operative circuit would even consider the gig. Long-term, and in a boring location, it spelled double jeopardy for any of her peers. Plus, there was a baby. And anyway, she didn't want another professional in the house. The paranoia would run thicker than her oatmeal. Esther had made some preemptive small talk at the feed and general stores about a husband being on the job, about getting the homestead ready for his return. In service to her needs, she went to the Sunday coffee hour and asked prominent-seeming families if they had a daughter that could spend a few hours a week as a mother's helper. Esther figured she could eventually event for the husband a tragic death, an oil rig explosion, perhaps an industrial accident, and settle into a quiet widowhood. In the meantime, and perhaps indefinitely, another presence would deter all but the boldest interlopers, at least in public. It wouldn't hurt to have somebody else around to change a diaper or two, she'd admit that. Still, Esther would have preferred to go it alone, rather than keep up her cover relentlessly at home as well as amongst the townspeople. A few matrons volunteered their children, and one or two even offered to come themselves, but Esther balked. Then one blustery day, fortune intervened. About a month after Esther took up residence at the farmhouse at the edge of town, a man approached the property from the east on foot, shouldering a modest backpack and a bedroll tied to the bottom. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, a scant 5'11", wiry but not skinny, medium complexion, brown eyes, an ordinary fellow in all respects, save one. The vagrant's defining quality wasn't something you could locate in an eye color or single physical trait. He seemed to wear a deep and permanent smile, even with his mouth at rest. There was no deformity that made him appear so, no twitch or paralysis. It was simply the impression one had of him. Esther felt immediately that the stranger from the East had not come to kill her or the baby. She watched from the porch as he drew near, and when he was at the gate, she invited him in for coffee and a slice of pie. My name is Esther. It's a pleasure, Esther. Folks call me Jed. So we're going to talk about surprises. And when I was thinking about this, I wasn't necessarily thinking surprises for the reader, as in cliffhangers or things that were exposed. But as Tiffany was talking about, surprises that came to us as we were writing. And it's what makes it fun, right?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things we were talking about in our private chat, or it came up, there's been a lot of action in that chat lately, was now the thought has completely lost my mind because I was thinking about all the things that have come up in chat. Yes, please continue. It will come back to me in a miracle moment.
In a surprise.
In a surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I will say, having just followed up that one again, that it will not seem surprising to anybody, looking at me or considering from an exterior, but the fact that I was just fascinated by a middle-aged woman in my book was an enormous surprise to me. She didn't show up to be of particular interest except to sort of perform a function, which of course is sort of the stereotype of the middle-aged woman, right? And as she continued to emerge, I was almost embarrassed by my original plans for her, right? Like shamed, in fact.
That's what it was. That's what it was in our chat. We were like, the plans that we make, like we go in with this intention, and then it doesn't matter what we plan in advance because the surprises are going to happen, and we just gotta go with it. So, yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you didn't.
I had to say it while it was there.
Yes. Yes. What the two of you have mentioned thus far are character surprises. Characters either doing things that you didn't expect them to do, or characters coming into current projects that were intended for other projects. And I was thinking as you were reading, maybe I'll put the question out there. What other types of surprises? I imagine there's plot surprises. Or Beth, maybe what surprises came out of the section that you chose to read, Beth?
Well, I don't think that I chose that one for the surprises, but as I think about it, the character of Juana of God was a big surprise because when I first introduced her, I thought I was kind of going to do a critique of traditional healer. Like I had this whole thing about traditional healers that I watched on television on Oprah, and it made me a little bit crazy. So I invented Juana of God to kind of push back on that. And then she took over the book in some ways. I mean, she became not only one of my favorite characters, but also one of the wisest characters in the book. So her character did totally transform as I kept writing her. So, I think characters that surprise you are probably, that's where you really have to let go of intention, because if you want a character to come up to life for the reader, she has to come to life for you, I think.
Yeah.
But what about you, Bridget? Yours, you're kind of, drawing on characters that have already been created and then pushing back in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they have been created, but the textual work around them is very small, and it's not very fleshed out. We know nothing of their personalities, and so because they're kind of flattened characters, I think I work with the idea that they are a flattened character, and play against what ideas we might have around them. But they absolutely surprise me on the page, and I do have this story. I didn't, and the story that I read does have a character surprise, and that I didn't know Mary Magdalene was going to be in it. I have another story. Eve is in 2 other stories, and Eve, in one of those 2 other stories, she is in a story with Lilith, and I thought that they might convene back together for this story. But I'd also just written a story unto Mary Magdalene herself, and she wanted to hang out with these 2. So
I get it. I totally get it.
So that happened.
Yeah.
I want to ask Tiffany and then the group, because I was thinking too, as everyone was reading about, in a way, it's almost the surprise of consistency, what we're always writing about in a way, and how it manifests and how it manages to show up in the work. And I was thinking of environment, particularly when we were talking about this earth that was on fire in yours, and Committal too works a lot with catastrophic change. But it's not just sort of picking a subject and writing about it. It's sort of, because certainly Committal, it didn't start there, but it gets there. And I'm thinking about place and what we're drawn, Beth and Tiffany too, and writing to about that, or what we're drawn back to that we keep seeming to return to or need to explore.
Mine isn't place necessarily. Mine, if I'm being honest, mine is death. Like that is just a topic that I can't seem to write away from, no matter what intention. I joke with my family and say, like, one day I'm going to write a book, and the very first sentence is going to be, this is a story in which no one dies. And then I decided that right after that it will say, because everyone is already dead.
Surprise.
Yeah, surprise. But yeah, death is that topic for me. I can't get away from it.
Me too. It was funny because I sent my son I sent him Jillian in the Borderlands, and he sent me a text that said, and then they all died, the end. I was like, oh, well, thanks a lot, Michael.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, this book is in a very specific place, the Borderlands, the desert. And the desert is a place of, there has spiritual dimensions, even coming from the Bible, the idea that Jesus went out into the desert. And so I think the place in Jillian in the Borderlands becomes a character in and of itself. And one thing that I was trying to do with place there was, they go to Mexico to escape. So I was trying to kind of invert north and south in this book in certain ways, or at least push against the stereotypes of the Borderlands itself and Mexico as this place where all the bad things happen. So.
And I guess if we're doing place, sorry, Beth, I didn't mean to.
Well, I didn't intend, that wasn't an original intention, but it's an intention that grew out of the writing. So I think that's one way that our work surprises us, is in the way the work itself has its own intentions in a way. And what we have to do is discover what they are and go with them.
Yeah.
Kind of like your Leslie character inserting himself in your book.
Leslie, man, let me tell you, that was a struggle. I really bucked against it. I had people telling me straight away, Leslie needs to have his own chapters. And I was like, no, Leslie wasn't even supposed to be in this book, right? But they were right, and I was just being stubborn. So.
And Esther was like that too.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think the idea of Mary Magdalene sneaking her way in is just, the stories are asking to give them what they need to come to fruition. I want to, before you move to the Q&A too, one thing I wanted to ask you about your book, Tiffany, or have you talk about too, is this wonderful sense of movement. So not only is the cover full of movement, visually. But like we're talking about Leslie. Leslie is always in one of two cars, or he's walking, or, or we're on the train, or, it's a city, it's Chicago, and we're always moving. And I just wanted you to say something toward that.
Yeah. Well, that is very true of my experience of Chicago. We didn't own a car when I lived in Chicago. And we lived right at the end of the Brown Line. So all of our travel was via public transit or walking. And the people that I did know that had vehicles, it was always a problem. Cars are a problem in a city. But yeah, it's not so much that I wanted the motion, it's just that the motion is a part of Chicago. You can't live in a city like Chicago and be in motion, was my experience anyway. I mean, anytime we wanted to go anywhere, we were guaranteed it was a 45-minute trip.
And it's a sort of surprising way that, that the bones of the story work with some thematic things, right? Like you're going to get carried along in some places in life and in story, and you're going to plant your feet in other places. I just thought that worked so well throughout the whole book.
And one of the things, the reason why Donovan and Emily ever came into being is because as a person who had a regular commute, you did see the same people for the most part, and you did notice when they were gone and when they would suddenly reappear. Like, you didn't have to be a creep for that to happen. That was just like, people were timepieces. So in a lot of ways, all of those things that Donovan is reflecting about other people, or using other people for, is just the nature of public transit. And you do think that you get to know people in those 5 to 7 minutes that you share with them, especially if you wind up in conversation with them on a regular basis.
It takes very little information to build a story about someone in your mind, right?
Yeah.
And that is just perfect setting
really
for that.
Okay. Are we moving on to Q&A?
We have another minute.
Okay.
Irene, did you want to speak to place in your book? You asked,
Well, I think, in many ways, I sort of, if I set out to, disrupt that sort of sense of rootedness. I mean, we talk about, I talk about farming in the book, but it's in a Dust Bowl location of the United States. So it's just taking root in general is a difficult concept in this. The vehicles in the book move very fast. There's this sort of scavenger hunt that spans across the continental US. Nobody lights for long, kind of thing. And even the house, even the house in Kansas is going to blow away any minute in a storm. So I think that it was a way of thinking about place as being very not untenable, but difficult to stay in and to live in. The earth is difficult and pissed, but also difficult.
Now that you mention it, I never pictured one thing growing on a farm.
No, you can't. Yeah.
That's so
I also think your language is compressed in such a way as to, there's some movement there too, as far as
Wow, and that's when I think of Bridget's. I'm trying to think. Okay, Bridget's book. The movement is in the language itself, like through time, and not so much related to place itself. It's just really interesting.
I do think I certainly try to plant some sensory details that invite place because of that sense of the sense of timelessness. And the sense
I almost feel like those women are holding up that sunset though. I just get that impression. They are just delaying it and holding it.
They have very strong arms.
We do.
You know, it's interesting that you would say that, because I definitely felt, you said they were flat characters, you know, in their original texts, but they're all very burdened, right?
Mhm.
They have heavy burdens. And so what Irene just said about the holding up the sunset, I definitely felt like the burden of holding up that sunset for these
Yeah.
three women is very beautiful. Very
Mm,
beautiful.
thank you.
We
Well,
have questions, I wonder, because, you know,
I don't know.
We can
well, we
always.
can always talk.
Yeah, Q&A can be slow to start sometimes, but first of all, I mean, thank you for running this reading and such an interesting conversation. I figure I will, oh, I see a question here from Shireen, who asked, when your reader's eyes pass over the end, quote unquote, the end, what do you want them to think or feel or take away from your book? Great question.
I'll start.
Okay.
Let's go in reading order and make it easy. I shouldn't have said I would start. I want people to have a conversation. I want them to think about their limited perspective. I want them to think about the judgments that they make about people given very small slices of time. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that. I think that what I wanted in the book was just for people to be moved by the characters and what happened to them. And I really don't know what I hoped. I know that I had to end the book on a kind of lighter note because it was so heavy. So I wanted to end with a kind of hope for things changing.
A couple of people that I know have asked with respect to my chapbook if they need to like brush up or learn the original stories. And I say, no, you already know, even if you did not grow up in a household where you learned those tales, they're actually a part of the world you live in. And that's what I want people to be thinking about when they read the end. How are these stories inherent to our everyday lives, even if it doesn't seem obvious?
I keep thinking of how I felt. I didn't have this experience because I read M Theory on my own in my own head, but I had the delightful experience of hearing aloud and in progress Jillian in the Borderlands and origin stories. And I keep thinking of what I felt at the end of them, which was always very emotional, and not necessarily eloquently so. And quiet as well. I think when I think about, I don't know that I have any desires for how I want people to feel at the end of committal, except that they've caught, something in their butterfly net. There's a lot of noise in that book, and whatever stuck, that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that's of value, whether it's the humor or the ideas around climate, or whether it's the idea of family relationships or any relationships and how we intersect and overlap in ways that we can't even imagine. But do I want that? I don't know. I just think, whatever happens, don't hate it. Don't have
What
hate
if
it.
some of us want to catch Viggo Mortensen on it?
Get in line, baby.
He does make a cameo in Irene's book.
He does.
So does Daniel Day-Lewis, who is another sort of.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sammy. I love you.
He's one of the 10 who's here.
I know. I'm
so
walking
you
tender line there.
So you all answered that question in very different ways, and you've all written very different books. And I'm curious, can you explain your background for us? Like, how do you know each other? How did this panel come about?
This is the power of an MFA right here. That's what I'm going to say. It's about writing community, writing family, really, is what it feels like to me, is finding people who you connect with, that it doesn't matter what you're writing or if you write the same things or wildly different things. It's about having a community of people that you know and love and trust and respect and can help you through your writing adventures. That's my answer anyway.
Yeah, I mean, who could say more beautifully than that? And the nuts and bolts of Tiffany's answer is that we were all a part of the OSU MFA program that's out of the Cascades campus. Beth is still a part of that program as a faculty member, and the other three of us went through it as students at some point.
And the thing that's so funny, is everyone's heard the myths about the workshop story, the MFA, you know, like with the MFA, that it like homogenizes people's writing, and yet here we are,
Yeah.
very good friends, and our writing is not at all homogenous.
That's true. And I would say that, you know, even though the legitimate thread that pulls through us is the MFA, I will say though that community post MFA is a very intentional act. It is not an automatic or a given that the people you've been through an MFA with will remain your writing community. That takes a lot. In fact, everything after an MFA is what the MFA is about. It's all the community building. It all comes after you walk away and make out of the MFA. It's a very harsh reality that community is not automatic. And that becomes sort of a dire circumstance. Yeah. So yes, we are consciously grateful and apply ourselves to this community, I think. And it's also fun. It's really, really fun.
Were you all working on these books in the MFA program then, or were those post-MFA projects?
So M theory is actually my thesis project for my MFA. But like Irene and I were not in the program at the same time as one another. And Bridget and I had a little bit of overlap, but I don't know if Bridget and Irene, did you have any overlap together as students together?
Well, I have a lot of overlap, but it's only because I never left. I cooked for the program for several years after I left. So I had the great honor and joy of meeting successive cohorts.
And we had the pleasure of eating your food.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The real community took place in Irene's kitchen.
So technically, I was attached to the MFA when I was writing committal, but it played no part in my graduate school
Your studies
process. Yeah.
And one of the stories, I wrote one story in the MFA program that I thought was just going to be a one-off. And I actually think that Beth said, no, you should keep writing more of these. So most of them have been written post-MFA.
Beth is actually the wind beneath our collective wings. We all have a Beth story about a moment of inspiration and doggedness.
Doggedness, that's what I'm good at.
Doggedness.
It's my gift.
Death and doggedness.
Plus, Beth is very sassy.
When I got my first book published, I wrote and I signed it to myself, and I said, "Thank you for your perseverance."
Well, do you have that?
Yes.
So I seeing a question in the chat here from Courtney, who asked, or she said, I loved hearing about how your characters often end up straying and defining their own narratives and personalities in your story. That was the theme, right? The surprises.
Mhm.
And how often they completely strayed from your plans. How do you know when to let them wander and when to pull them back into your plans for the story?
Never pull them back. Never pull them back. For me, anyway, I can't, because once I start inserting my own, whatever that would be called, my own wants into the story, then it's all just, sorry, I'm not going to swear. It's all just messed up after that. Sorry, that was a good one. I caught myself.
Authorial presence.
Thanks, Irene.
I love hearing your answer on this, Tiffany, because what I know of how your writing process, you are like the paragon. If we were in a on the metro together and you were a stranger to me, I mean, what I know of you is that you're very organized. And so I love hearing that you also let, your characters go too, that is part of your process. And I never know what my characters are going to do. I live in a state of surprise.
Yeah, I come home from writing and I'm like, I'll look at Scott and I'll say, can you believe that so-and-so just said, like they're an actual real person? And sometimes it makes me really angry.
I once tried to, in the early stages before I should have, I tried to describe committal to an accomplished author and friend. And I got about 20 seconds in to this hair-raising description of these plot and these characters. And I can see him just sort of slipping away. Like, he just let me go on, and I could see him just back slowly. And that moment taught me a lot about keeping it a little locked down when you're letting your characters run free. Nobody else needs too much information about that process.
Maybe it's like a playground. You want to have enough supervision, but not be overbearing. No one needs to get hurt, but let them go.
Beth?
Well, this book was so strange. I mean, it was interesting in that I don't know how many narrators are in this book or how many characters, and you hear from each of them. So I would begin each section with I had to have a sentence, and then it was just a matter, it really was almost a matter of just letting the characters talk and until they got through talking. And then I knew it was time for another section where another character would talk. So in some ways, the book was a completed experiment, and almost everything about it was a surprise. But on the other hand, it's the most deliberate thing I've ever written. So I don't really understand that dialectic. It was like Bridget was talking about containers the other night. It was like I figured out what the containers were for the stories, and then the characters just filled them. So I did the architecture and they peopled the house. I don't know how else to think about it. But to me, there's that interesting tension between knowing and not knowing, and allowing the not knowing to take over when it does, because that's when the work comes alive.
When it does, you just pray for that moment, don't you?
Yeah.
And when it happens, you're like, please don't acknowledge that it's happening right now, because it will be over. It will be over.
No matter what it is.
Hey, well, I just got kicked off, but I'm back.
I saw you.
Yeah.
I hope I'm not interrupting anything, but we are just at the end of our time for this event. So thank you so much for coming. This was such a thoughtful panel to host. And Tiffany, Beth, Irene, and Bridget, I truly appreciate your willingness to share your time and your insight with us. Congratulations on all of your post-MFA successes. To our audience members, support these authors by buying M Theory, Jillian and the Borderlands, committal, and origin stories here with us. You can find them by clicking the links I pasted into the chat or coming straight into our storefront. Your support helps small bookstores like us stay open and bring authors to our community. So on that note, thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you back for more events soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.